got interested in this, we Paul and I and Nicole have been working with a couple of committees to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the 1982 World's Fair. And one of our bigger projects involved with this is a booklet that we're going to have available to distribute in about 6 weeks, we hope. But it's a booklet about the World's Fair and what is historic about it and what makes it memorable. But it's a more difficult question to answer than you might think, and we hope we can add something to the understanding of it through this work. But I began looking into this, and I thought why everybody was astonished in 1982 and in the years leading up to it that Knoxville was hosting a World's Fair. And I began wondering how peculiar was this anyway? How detached from the whole tradition of World's Fairs was Knoxville? Because I could think of 2 or 3 anecdotal stories about Knoxvillians being involved in other World's Fairs before 1982. And then I thought, well, it's not just 2 or 3, there's 4 or 5. And I began looking into that and realized there were 6 or 7, and realized that Knoxvillians have been involved in most of the big World's Fairs in history in one way or another. And some of these fairs have come back and had an influence on the city of Knoxville in ways that we can point to today. We're kind of a World's Fair culture in a way, and we're even before 1982 and interesting in different ways. But it all begins with a big fair back in 1851 that anybody that saw the Victoria miniseries on PBS knows about the Great Exhibition in London. I think the full name of that was the Great Exhibition of Works of Industry in All Nations, was the title of that big and kind of to some extent unprecedented fair in London in 1851. There had been some trade shows, big trade shows in London and especially Paris, and also Turin, Italy, and a few other places before that, but nothing on this scale where they were inviting the whole world to see everything, more or less, the work of England and the work of America and all these other nations that were part of this enormous festival. This was the place where a lot of people saw their first Matthew Brady daguerreotypes, the first Samuel Colt revolvers, the first Singer sewing machines, the first Morse teletype machines. Lots of the first Goodyear rubber. All these things were being shown at the London Fair. And Knoxville was just a tiny town at this time, just 3,000 people, and we didn't have any influence on the fair that I could have been able to discern. But we paid close attention to it. Even here in our weekly papers, we saw all people were interested in this fair. This is the famous Crystal Palace, the interior of the Crystal Palace, which is where a lot of the most interesting exhibitions were. But this was something that everybody knew about, even in remote places. And Knoxville advertisers used references to the fair. People would sell patent medicine and say, just like at the London Fair, whether it was actually there or not. But one thing that's kind of charming in Knoxville was that one of the things you hear about that wasn't as revolutionary as the Singer sewing machine or the Colt revolver was the spring-loaded gate that farmers found extremely useful, a gate that closes behind you even without turning around to pull it closed. This was something that was perfected and shown at the London Fair, and was advertised in Knoxville, was sold in Knoxville as something that had been hailed at the London Great Exhibition. So it was this idea of having a giant exhibition of everything good about your society, of everything, all the triumphs of your business and industry in one place was fascinating to people, and fascinating even on a micro scale. Knoxville, I don't think it's a coincidence that a couple of years later, Knoxville had its first fair, and it was a collection. It was like a tiny version of this, and they called it this is part of the East Tennessee Agricultural Fair. The formal name of it was State Fair of the Eastern Division, but this was in 1854, and it took place down at the old glass factory, which was on the riverfront on the southeastern edge of town. If you were to go down Volunteer Landing past the marina to the east, to walk down the bike trail there, you would come within proximity of where this fair happened in the fall of 1854. And I'd always heard it was an agricultural fair, as this certificate indicates that was part of it. But there was a lot of other stuff there as well. There was, and agriculture was fascinating. They had giant watermelons and lots of things that people were proud of that they had grown over the growing season. But they also had exhibits of marble finishing. Marble was kind of new as an industry. We knew we had marble here, but we were starting to do stuff with it in the 1850s. They had exhibits of embroidery. And this was interesting. I'd love to find out more detail about it. They had exhibits of beer making. Beer was something that some people knew how to make, and they were just making it for the families, but it was just becoming a commodity in the 1850s in Knoxville and becoming popular, especially with the immigration from Germany and Ireland at this time. But also freight cars. And interestingly, think about this, in 1854, they were exhibiting locally built freight cars. This was a year before we had railroads here, but they were already knew that they were going to be needing freight cars, and they were enterprising industrialists were making some freight cars to exhibit at this fair. I would love to know more about this fair than we do, but it's just a pretty fascinating little chapter, just a hint of things to come. Of course, we were much distracted with what went on in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. The Civil War and its aftermath set everything aside for a while. But America did not have its first proper World's Fair until 1876. And that was up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And of course, it was the Centennial Fair. This is the Centennial of America. And they had a big exposition in the place where America started at Philadelphia. And it was a general purpose World's Fair. It had kind of a universal purpose to it, although they did especially emphasize natural resources, and including some of the extracted industries that were kind of charging much of the American economy at the time. It had a few interesting things. We will later on see a part of the Statue of Liberty, but this actually had the torch of the right hand and torch of the Statue of Liberty that would not be actually put together and built until several years later. But it included that. But a lot of there were major inventors there. Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison were there showing their latest work. And a lot of Knoxville movers and shakers were there. Knoxville was growing really fast in the 1870s. And we suddenly had industry, and we had these young men, especially young men who were involved in inventing new things and creating new things for the local or state or even world market for goods. And one of these people who actually did work in the international market was a guy named J. Allen Smith, who was from Atlanta, but he was working in Atlanta in Knoxville at the time, and was working with flour. He would eventually create something called white lily flour, but he was there as a visitor at the World's Fair. I love I've got a whole list of kind of prominent Knoxvillians who were there. A couple of brothers named Frank and Calvin Mclung were there. And it's interesting that these two guys who went on the same train together to the Philadelphia World's Fair today are remembered for, respectively, the Mcclung Museum at UT is named for Frank Mclung, and the Mclung Collection and as part of the library is named for Calvin Mclung. But these two guys were sitting in the same seat, probably in a railroad car on the way to Philadelphia to see this amazing World's Fair. A few Knoxville names are there. One of this is not a Knoxville product, but the Kanaba Piano was much hailed at the fair as one of the best American pianos. And Gustavus Kanaba was there. He was a Knoxvillian. He was not one of the piano making people, but I'm sure he was kin to them because he was a local agent for Kanaba pianos. But he was the guy that was the beginning of our classical music tradition. But this is Mclong Tower is named for a third Mclung, actually, Charles. But they're all the same family, of course. But it was interesting, those two guys that have museums named for them were there together. Anyway, this was attractive to a lot of people. But interestingly, one of the stars of the Philadelphia World's Fair, and this again was a World's Fair that to some extent emphasized ore and mining and quarrying, was Tennessee marble. This was something that was highlighted at the Philadelphia World's Fair. And Paul, if we have the next picture, we see the actual building where this was being shown. This is a building called the Government Building, a U.S. Government Building at the Philadelphia World's Fair. That one of those wings had an exhibit of Tennessee marble from Knoxville in it, and that was the Knoxville Marble Company. In fact, won the prize for best colored marble in America at this World's Fair. And it's interesting how much press this got at the time. I did just an open search for this Tennessee marble, and in everywhere from Reno, Nevada, which described Tennessee marble as pretty and interesting as the fossils contained in them polished to give them a mottled appearance, to Rutland, Vermont. Now Vermont is already famous for marble, but in Rutland, Vermont, which has a very high standard for their assessing marble, admitted that Tennessee marble compares favorably to that of the marble of Vermont. Anyway, this was something. By the end of the fair, Knoxville and Tennessee marble was famous, and it's not surprising that by the end of 1876, Knoxville was getting orders from as far away as San Francisco for architectural marble to build buildings in San Francisco. Anyway, over the next 40 years, of course, architects in several eastern cities from Washington to New York were building monumental structures with Tennessee marble. And this wasn't the only place where there was a market for it before this, but I think this really supercharged the interest in Knoxville marble. But it's interesting to look at the uses of marble here in Knoxville at the time. For example, this fair was held right after the completion of the Custom House downtown. And Paul, we have a picture of that next, right? Or actually, here's an early marble quarry. This is a 19th century picture of the Gray Eagle Quarry, one of several quarries in the area, and you can actually see some of the color that they were talking about at the Philadelphia World's Fair. In the next picture, this is the very familiar Custom House, which is now the East Tennessee History Center, finished in 1874, and the architect Alfred Mullett was a guy that used Tennessee marble all over the place and was very impressed with it. And I think he used it even in the New Orleans Custom House, which was also, it has a very similar style. So marble was there, and it was something people noticed. And actually, I forgot how many tons of, like 20 or 30 tons of Knoxville marble were on display at the Philadelphia Exposition. So it was, and different kinds of marble too. And it was kind of, people remarked on the variety of it. But anyway, these are American fairs, but we also were interested in other fairs around the world as well. What's the next one, Paul? Yeah, here we go. This is the next Paris exposition, the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1878. This was Paris was the capital of World's Fairs, and still is to this day. It's where the Bureau of International Expositions is located. Is in Paris, and the bureau that sanctioned the Knoxville World's Fair of 1982 is in Paris. And nobody's had more World's Fairs than Paris has, especially really big ones. But this was famous for inventors like Edison and Bell were there as well. And also we have a fascinating photograph, don't we, Paul? Next, yeah, here's the head of the Statue of Liberty. Remember it's kind of gruesome almost, but the forearm and torch were on display at the Philadelphia World's Fair. 2 years later, they have the head finished and ready to show at the Paris World's Fair of 1878. But a lot of one of the most worldly men in Knoxville in the 1870s was a guy named Peter Stahl. He's the guy who built and designed our European style opera house. We elected a mayor right after that. He served as a Swiss consul in America, and also later as a U.S. consul in Switzerland. He got around quite a lot, and he was not only went to the Paris World's Fair of 1878, he was a commissioner, appointed a commissioner from Tennessee to the Paris World's Fair, and they were kind of in charge of being sure that Tennessee was well represented at this World's Fair in Paris. So this is a guy, a very familiar guy in Knoxville, a very familiar name. Stav's Opera House was the most famous building in Knoxville in the late 19th century. But a really interesting guy that we should remember better. But anyway, but an interesting time. How many interesting connections there were to Paris. Lots of other Knoxvillians went to this Paris Fair. This was a time when you, of course, had to have a good deal of money to get to Europe. But many people who did, took that opportunity to do so. Of course, it was maybe not quite as famous today as another Paris World's Fair in 1889. And it was one that was famous for the theme structure, which was the Eiffel Tower. This is, I think, the first permanent theme structure ever built for a World's Fair. Philadelphia had planned one, a theme tower for the World's Fair, but never built it. But France did, and this is the first of the whole series of World's Fair theme structures that lead up to the Sun Sphere. This is the Eiffel Tower, and interestingly, like the Sun Sphere, a lot of Frenchmen, especially artists, hated it when it was built. Artists and architects couldn't stand the thing, but it nonetheless became iconic for Paris, and I think the same thing is to some extent happened with the Sun Sphere here. But it was. There were a good many Knoxvillians went to this one too. The most interesting one of them all, I think, was a new chemistry professor at UT named Charles E. Waite, W-A-I-T. He was a well-known guy in science. He was a fellow of the British Society of Chemists, even though it's based in London. This guy in Knoxville was a fellow in that group, and he was in Europe that year in 1889, looking around some, went to the World's Fair, and came back to Knoxville with ideas for building the science building on UT campus. Yeah, unfortunately, it's not there anymore, but it's a big Victorian building that had room for all the things that he thought a science building needed rooms for, especially chemistry related things. He was a chemist who was interested in the chemistry of nutrition, by the way. It was kind of a pioneer in understanding how chemistry and nutrition work together. He was also one of the leading advocates of athletics at UT before UT had athletics. He was athletic director of the university for many years, and saw the first football and baseball teams that UT fielded during that period. But he was people. It's kind of ironic and perverse in a way that people are remembered for different things. But here's a guy who was an outstanding scientist in his day, respected in England. But today he's remembered mainly as the guy for whom Waite Field is named. It was the first athletic field on campus, but by the end of its career, when Professor Waite was still alive, it was considered kind of a laughing stock. It was a substandard field by modern NCAA standards, and it was the one replaced by the Sheila's Watkins Field at Neyland Stadium. But Waite Field was at the corner of West Phil Fulmer and Cumberland Avenue, and he was very proud of it in around 1900 when it was established. But it later on it was partly uphill, and it had some rock on it and stuff. It was not good for for football. And when people talk about Wake, the few people who've ever heard of Wakefield make fun of it. And hardly anybody has ever heard of Charles Waite. But anyway, he was here at Paris looking for ideas to bring back to his new university, his new home where he would spend the rest of his life. He died in 1923. Anyway, next we have Chicago. We go to Chicago. I think the first really big fair in America, and maybe the most influential World's Fair in American history, was the Colombian Exposition at Chicago. You might know about this from what I think is a great book of nonfiction called The Devil in the White City. It's a murder mystery, kind of a horrible murder mystery, but it's also one of the best descriptions of the World's Fair that I've ever read. This was a very big deal. The Colombian Exposition, they called it that because it was near the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. They were delayed it by a year. A lot of the expositions get delayed by a year, as did the '82 World's Fair. It had it was the famous White City Fair. It was the White City because it popularized the use of streetlights. This idea that you could just have a floodlit city was kind of a new idea. We'd had a couple of streetlights in Knoxville before this, but Chicago kind of showed us that the whole place can stay brightly lit late at night, and people can get around just fine. It was also the fair that popularized the City Beautiful movement, and this had a big effect on Knoxville. Cities had been practical places. People lived close together because they lived in their factories and they have to walk to work or whatever. But this idea was that American cities, should be beautiful, and they can be beautiful with introduction of parks and greenways and the things we take for granted today. This was a new idea for Knoxville, which had no public parks at this time, really. But we can look at Knoxville and see connections to all this. What's our next one, Paul? Yeah, here's of course the famous Ferris wheel, and it's in I think the first big one, and a new invention in those days. And we're showing it because, of course, we had what was claimed to be the biggest Ferris wheel in the world here in Knoxville in 1982, 89 years later. But this is the one that was at Chicago. Next one, Paul. All right, this is a guy, Frederick Law Olmsted. I'm sure you know his name. He was the guy that designed Central Park early in his career. But later on was involved with, of course, Biltmore House and Gardens in North Carolina. But then also he was the lead designer for the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Interestingly, the same year he was involved in something in Knoxville, and we don't know for sure what it was. We know about it mainly from a series of letters that he and Dabney wrote back and forth to each other about the Knoxville project. He was here working on something. Some people have posited that it might be Circle Park, which is now part of UT campus, was then a private residential area. And some people think it was the very big park on the top of the Cherokee Bluffs, which was going to be connected by the cable car. And that's a kind of a World's Fair thing itself, but that was being built the same year as the Chicago World's Fair in Knoxville. So we were kind of aspiring maybe to stretch ourselves as a city the same year as the Chicago Fair happened. Unfortunately, both the Chicago Fair and all these improvements in Knoxville ran into the Great Depression of the 1890s, the Panic of 1893, which just ruined a whole lot of ideas. But the cable car ran for a few weeks, and after a fatal accident, they just didn't bother to rebuild it. Anyway, but Olmsted was part of something going on here during that time. One of the most influential, I think, the most influential landscape architect in American history, certainly in the 19th century. And his sons later on came here and designed the famous Sanford Arboretum, which has completely vanished today. But anyway, an influential fellow. And what's the next one, Paul? Oh, yeah, here's a guy who was at the fair as a planner of a Tennessee exhibit, and I don't know as much about this as I would like. We're including this picture of Thomas Lanier Williams II because you know the name of his grandson, who was formerly named Thomas Lanier Williams III, but we know him better as Tennessee Williams, the playwright. But Thomas Lanier Williams II was representing Tennessee at the Chicago World's Fair and helping plan some of the Tennessee exhibits there. But anyway, he's buried at Old Gray Cemetery. This is probably the height of his career. He had a kind of a repeatedly disappointing political career. Ran for governor a few times and didn't get very far. But anyway, he was one of the people that you would see there at the Chicago Fair. Next one. All right, I was talking about the City Beautiful movement, and the City Beautiful movement was these happened about 20 years after the Chicago Fair. This is and actually this is a later idea for Tyson Park from a newspaper, probably 40 years after the Chicago Fair. But when they established Tyson Park and Caswell Park, and also Luttrell Park, which doesn't exist anymore, it was mainly philanthropists, mainly women, wives of powerful men, including Betty Tyson, who were behind the City Beautiful movement in Knoxville. And this was expressed through establishment of the first real parks in the city: Tyson Park, Caswell Park, and Luttrell Park on the south side of the river, which later became occupied mainly by Baptist Hospital, were established as a result of the City Beautiful movement, and not long after the Chicago World's Fair. So I thought we'd throw this in just to kind of suggest that. Paul found this picture and thought it'd be good to use it. All right, next one, please. All right, here's the Exposition from Paris in 1900, and this was another very influential World's Fair. Kind of the Art Nouveau movement was much touted at the Paris World's Fair of 1900, and this was a World's Fair that was celebrated with fireworks, and they were celebrating electricity, and as we had electricity, but you never seen more of it than there was at the Paris World's Fair in 1900. But also diesel engines, the motion pictures, and as I say, the Art Nouveau movement. To represent Tennessee there, the governor of Tennessee at the time picked a woman to be the commissioner at the Paris World's Fair, and her name is Mary Boyce Temple. And this is a picture of her probably about the time that she was a commissioner at the Paris World's Fair. We're lucky we still have her final home standing in downtown Knoxville on the corner of Henley and Hill Avenue. But she was a kind of a formidable. She was a Vassar grad, kind of a formidable presence. Never married, but had some resources through inherited wealth, and kind of devoted herself to causes. She's the lady that saved, as Paul mentioned earlier, saved Blunt Mansion from demolition, and we're lucky her home still stands. There were other Knoxvillians who had positions of some authority there, and Paul, who's next here? Yeah, and this guy's one of them. Charles Dabney was the president of UT. He was a scientist himself, but was very interested in World's Fairs. He had attended the Chicago World's Fair, and was fascinated with it, but was a juror at the Paris World's Fair of 1900. But he went there and spent the whole I think a lot of the duration of the fair there. He also served. It's amazing that the guy that was president of the university was also undersecretary of agriculture for the United States, but also a juror at the Paris World's Fair. I think that he probably enjoyed being a juror at the Paris World's Fair more than his other jobs. But he came back and he gave a popular presentation of somehow did a public stereopticon presentation. I'm not sure what that looked like. At the auditorium at Market Square after the fair was over the following December, about kind of a travel log showing the Paris World's Fair as he knew it. And about 400 people showed up. It was just it was something that was very proud that he'd been there and proud to show it off. But one of the more remarkable things about the Paris World's Fair has to do with an exhibit of Knoxvillians that was there. I'm not sure that Dr. Dabney had anything to do with it. It was an exhibit called the Exhibition of American Negroes. And this was a time that a lot of Europeans had hardly ever seen Black people, and they'd only heard stories about the freedom of people who had been enslaved and were finding their way in America and actually becoming contributing members of society. And this is a guy named Charles Kanzler, whose name you might recognize. He was a well-known educator here in town, was principal of Vine High School. It was a Black high school in those days, and also was an author and was a very well-connected guy. He knew Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois and a lot of these people personally, and corresponded with them and sometimes brought them to Knoxville to speak. But he was a guy that was involved in an interesting project for the Paris World's Fair of 1900 to try to collect photographs of Black people achieving things in America. And Knoxville was one of 5 or 6 different cities that were considered good candidates for showing Black people who were professionals, who were landowners, who were successful businessmen, who were homeowners, and they would show pictures of these people in Knoxville at the Paris Fair of 1900. Another guy involved in this was a guy named Joseph Trigg, who was a Black city councilman, an alderman at the time. But he and Kanzler worked together to put this collection of photographs together. But these are all in the Library of Congress today, and we're lucky that they're saved and we can see them. But these are all pictures from Knoxville that were shown at the famous 1900 Paris World's Fair. Charles Dodson, a jeweler, is this one. This is a Black man making a prosperous living in Knoxville as a jeweler. And this was surprising to many people in France and in England who had never been around professional Black people before. And here's a Black family living in a nice Victorian style house on Patton Street. This is Patton Street. Part of it's still there, just east of the old city. I think was up in an area up on the hill near what Summit Hill is now. Summit Hill Drive is now. I don't know if this house was still there when they raised everything for urban renewal, but we don't know. But they're obviously interested and proud of their house. They got posing in his window, and a woman in her garden, and another woman in the house, but the principal homeowner and standing on the front steps there. But lovely shot, and a little kid in the corner down there too. But yeah, here's another home of an African American family, a Mr. Manning in East Knoxville. A Victorian house, a 2-story Victorian house. Next one, yeah, and here another a little cash grocery, a more modest place there, but on Asylum Street, which is now known as Western Avenue. Next one. All right, of course, after that, 1900 was the St. Louis World's Fair, and this is the fair we all know from the movie and the song, Meet Me in St. Louis. But this was a very big deal too in America, and it was the biggest the closest big World's Fair that had ever been to Knoxville. So a lot of Knoxvillians were interested in this. One of them, the people interested in this, was a guy named David Chapman. He was he was in his 20s, a very young pharmaceutical executive who actually led a committee to promote Tennessee at the St. Louis World's Fair. But look at this crazy picture of the St. Louis World's Fair. The architecture, most of this is temporary architecture, but it looks like a castle on the right and something almost surrealist on the left in the background there. It's almost like a Frank Gehry sort of thing in a way. Like some modern computer design architecture, but I would love to have seen this event. Lots of things were introduced in St. Louis that for a long time I thought we got our tamales from the St. Louis World's Fair, but in fact I found a lot of evidence that we had tamales before that. Most people didn't see tamales until they went to the Mexican Pavilion at the World's Fair, and but we already had them here. Street vendors were selling them here before that. Anyway, it's what else? There's a lot to say about this fair. We had UT professors who were involved in the agricultural part. Oh, okay, here's David Chapman on the left. As a young man, maybe about the time that he was at the St. Louis World's Fair. But here's the Tennessee State Building. Does it look familiar? It's the Hermitage. It's basically a perfect replica of the Hermitage. And I don't know whether Chapman had anything to say about thinking that was the best way to represent Tennessee or not. But one interesting thing about this is that the host of the exhibition was a woman, and she was 72 years old, and she was the granddaughter of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson didn't have any natural kids himself, but had adopted kids, but she considered herself the granddaughter of Andrew Jackson, had known him well, had lived at the Hermitage, and was 13 years old when Andrew Jackson died, remembered him well, and was happy to tell people in 1904, in the era of airplanes and motion pictures, she was able to tell what Andrew Jackson was like at home. So this was something kind of interesting. But lots of people, UT professors had an agricultural exhibit there. We had municipal promoters there, and there's I think we have what's the next one, Paul? Is that a picture of the? Yeah, this is one of a few promotional books, and probably the one that was distributed there. Progressive Knoxville. These were distributed by one account. I'm trying to remember how many hundreds of thousands of these were distributed at the St. Louis World's Fair. They were really pushing Knoxville harder than most southern cities at the St. Louis Fair, and this was a big deal. One of the Knoxville industries that actually exhibited there appropriately was an industry that had an international trade, and that was the C.B. Atkin Mantle Company, which claimed to be there. Yeah, Paul found a picture of it. Good. This is a picture. This is a company here in Knoxville that claimed to be the biggest mantle company in the world, and they imported special woods from Africa and worked on these things, and had a business in Europe. But they were I hesitate to say global, but they were something like that, a company in Knoxville. C.B. Atkin was later involved in the construction of the Bijou Theater, and was even involved, had a ownership interest in what became the Tennessee Theater too. So it's he's a guy who was all over the place here. Also at the St. Louis World's Fair was a future UT leader. I just learned this afternoon. Many of you have read the piece I wrote about Brown Ayres, that he was a Tulane professor and was a great leader in promoting the latest electrical technology of all sorts. He was considered kind of a wizard in New Orleans in the 1890s. But he actually led the entire Louisiana and New Orleans exhibitions at the St. Louis World's Fair. He put them all together. He was in charge of it. And it was the same year as the St. Louis Fair that UT offered him a job to move to Knoxville. And but this all happened right before that. He was a remarkable guy that I think needs to be respected for more than the fact that he was mainly a fundraiser when he worked at UT, I think. But the fair was so popular that Southern Railway added extra trains and had special prices for World's Fair tourists from East Tennessee. And despite its delights, the 1904 fair is associated with Tennessee's worst transportation disaster in history. This is the Newmarket train wreck. I grew up hearing about this train wreck, the worst transportation disaster. I mean, we never had a plane crash or a train wreck with a higher body count. We're not even sure what the body count was, but it was upwards of 70, it sounds like, who were killed that day when two trains collided. But we don't always hear about the people, the passengers, where they were going. And it was basically it was two trains of passengers who were heading to the St. Louis World's Fair, and passengers who had just been to the St. Louis World's Fair and were going back home. So this is kind of a sad thing. A lot of them had, I'm sure, had souvenirs of the fair in this horrible crash about 20 miles east of Knoxville. But anyway, I've run across this a lot in World's Fair research. There were lots of, I guess because they were adding extra trains for these World's Fairs, there were lots of fatal train wrecks. Even there's even one fatal train wreck coming from Knoxville to someone who's going to the Paris World's Fair. A few people were going to the East Coast to get a ship to Paris, and they were killed on a train before they got there. But that's just kind of the dark side of moving a whole lot of people around the country rapidly. But anyway, this is a time that Knoxville was growing very rapidly, and with so many people who'd seen World's Fairs in Paris and St. Louis and Chicago and Philadelphia, we said, why can't we have a big fair ourselves here? And in 1910, the city, we'd had bigger and bigger fairs since 1854, but we decided to have something that was big enough to be called an exposition. And this was what we did in 1910. And here's a picture that shows both the remarkable buildings that were built for the expositions, and I think they were inspired by the buildings at Chicago, especially the White City of Chicago. But also this astonishing bicycle high wire act, and as Paula remarked, there was a similar act there with a motorcycle a couple of years ago at the Tennessee Valley Fair. This is at Shell Highway Park, and this is where the Appalachian Expositions were in 1910 and 1911, and then the big 1913. See that beautiful building that was there for a long time. It burned down in the late 1930s. So it looks like marble from a distance, but it was built mostly of wood, which was typical for expositions and even World's Fair structures. But that was a typical fate for World's Fair structures to burn down. But the 1913 exposition was bigger than the other two. The National Conservation Exposition of 1913, more than 1 million people came to Knoxville over a period of 2 months in 1913 to see this National Conservation Exposition, the first ever exposition about the subject of conservation. And they were showing all sides of conservation, but they also had a lot of entertainments too. They had rides and motorcycle races and all sorts of stuff going on there as well. But this was such a big fair. The big reformers, Booker T. Washington, Helen Keller, William Jennings Bryan, all spoke there, and so did Gifford Pinchot, who was actually the chairman of the National Conservation Exposition. Gifford Pinchot, the famous conservationist from Pennsylvania, was there. Remarkably, this fair has changed in history just in the last 20 years. I've been studying it. I used to look for this when the internet first came up, and I found lists of expositions. And the general consensus in the 1990s, early 2000s, was that this fair was actually never held. I would see these two words, never held, with a question mark behind it. But today, it's not only listed, it's people know a lot about it, and actually, it's even listed in a Wikipedia list of World's Fairs. It was almost in some respects like a World's Fair. It was that big, that grand, that wide ranging in its interest. They had art there. They had Impressionist art, new Impressionist art, and lots of the latest technology on display, but also a building that was called the Negro Building that showed the best of African American work in the area. But an astonishing thing. I would love to have seen that. Most people got there by streetcar from downtown, but these people are probably waiting for the next streetcar to Gay Street. But anyway, what's the next one? All right, next one we're going to be talking about is the Chicago World's Fair of 1933. This is the second big World's Fair in Chicago. The Century of Progress. It was a centennial for the city of Chicago, and this was another big World's Fair. a lot of Knoxvillians went there. I just looked for a list of Knoxvillians, and I want to mention one in particular, Hattie Love, whose name is one that we should probably remember because she was the first female city councilman in Knoxville history. She was at that World's Fair. She was at the World's Fair not as a city councilman. It was actually right before she was elected, but she was president of the Knoxville chapter of the Federation of Professional Business and Women's and Professional Women's Clubs of America. She owned an ice cream company, and that was why she was a businesswoman. But she was there. June 8th was Tennessee Day at this fair, and they had something going on with Tennessee. I haven't quite figured out what they did there. But we remember this fair mainly for one person who came out of it, who had never been to Knoxville when this fair happened, but was a major figure in Knoxville history afterwards. And his name was Lowell Blanchard. Lowell Blanchard was a University of Illinois graduate. He had been an announcer and an actor in college at Illinois, and was just a showman. He was a professional show business guy, and was at the 1933 World's Fair as an announcer. He was a public announcer. He was the guy whose voice you would hear if you walked into the fair announcing the latest acts or whatever would be Lowell Blanchard. He was at the fair in 1933, and they had kind of an echo of the fair the following year, and kind of a reprise of the fair in 34. He was the announcer for the fair for both those years. But he came down to Knoxville in 1936, and he started something called the Midday Merry-Go-Round. He got a job at WNOX. And I think the most influential country music show outside of the Grand Ole Opry, perhaps, was the Midday Merry-Go-Round, which gave the stars to the careers of everybody from Chet Atkins to Archie Campbell to Don Gibson, Carter sisters, so many people, Arthur Q. Smith. In fact, Lowell Blanchard named Arthur Q. Smith. He had another name, and he said he thought Arthur Q. Smith was catchier. But he was probably the most powerful. You can talk about Kaz Walker if you want to, but I think Lowell Blanchard was the more powerful figure in country music development in Knoxville in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Interestingly, he and Kaz Walker were both on city council at the same time in the 1950s. So these former rivals of radio were suddenly political rivals later on. But a very interesting guy, a Chicagoan, and people used to make fun of his accent, but they didn't doubt that he knew his country music, and he knew all the stars, and he could get them to come here and broadcast on his radio station. But anyway, it's interesting that he's got this connection with the World's Fair in Chicago in '33. But let's see what we got next, Paul. Yeah, here's of course the big World's Fair that I keep saying the big World's Fair. There are so many big World's Fairs, but the New York World's Fair of 1939 is the famous one, the most stylish World's Fair perhaps, with the famous Trialon and Perisphere that you see in the background, and you can see these from many miles away. These were the theme structures of the fair. But this was the most. Some people have claimed, and this may be stretching a little bit, that the Knoxville Conservation Exposition was the first forward-looking fair, whereas most fairs before that had been historical and commemoration. And I'm not sure I would make that claim, but this was definitely a fair all about the future. This was mainly their emphasis. And they were showing us all the things that would be relevant to our future, including something that I think may have doomed World's Fairs, which was television. A lot of people saw television for the first time at the New York World's Fair of '39, yeah, so many things that people saw there for the first time. It was quite a lot going on. There were they had a Tennessee Day there as well, and we sent up 14 mountain dancers, singers, and instrumentalists. And I've tried to find out who these people were. I haven't found any names I recognize yet, but another several famous people were there. What's the next image, Paul? Okay, this was one of the most popular people at the fair, especially the first month of the fair. Grace Moore, and it's hard to imagine today having an opera singer being as popular as Grace Moore was in the 1930s. But this is the very height of her popularity. At this point, she had been nominated for an Oscar for a musical role in a movie, and she was mainly an opera singer, and much respected in the Met and elsewhere. But she did a recital basically on one day at the World's Fair, and it was completely packed. The whole Hall of Music, they called it. These things all sound very substantial. The Hall of Music hosted Grace Moore that May, the first month of the fair, and hundreds of people were there to witness it. She by that time but she was from East Tennessee, born in Cott County, spent her early childhood in Knoxville, but called Jellicoe her home. But she had performed in Knoxville several times. By this time, she had performed at UT's Alumni Hall, which is still there before the World's Fair. But she was one of the stars of the fair. She sang a recital of Debussy, Massenet, Bizet and other pieces at this recital. Who's next, Paul? These are all people who were at the New York World's Fair. Estes Kefauver people didn't recognize his name in 1939 when it was the World's Fair. He was the freshly elected congressman, former lawyer from Chattanooga, but who had lived in Knoxville before that. He was a UT grad, but well-known figure around here, but from just southwest of here. But he was young congressman at the time, and was, of course, would be much more famous in the 1950s when he was a presidential candidate and also a running mate on the Democratic presidential ticket, and with Adlai Stevenson in '56. But a pretty progressive guy who's looking back at him, he did a lot of positive good in his life. He resisted kind of the segregationists. He kind of helped cripple the Crump machine, the political machine out of Memphis, but was an opponent of organized crime. Did a lot of good things with his life. But he was one of the many people you might see if you were at the New York World's Fair of 1939. Next one. And here's another guy. He kind of made a habit of a World's Fair. Sergeant Alvin York was, of course, the hero of World War I, and was often seen in Knoxville. Was from Fettress County, but was a familiar figure here. Was at the New York World's Fair, was a big star there, gave a talk at the New York Fair on history, on Tennessee history, about the Long Hunters. That was what his subject was, and he was kind of tying this into the idea of modern defense. This was 1939, where everybody's worried about the Nazis and what we were going to have to deal with. And he was there with the governor of Tennessee at the time, who was what's his name, Prentice Cooper, who had been welcomed to New York by this group. I wonder if this group still exists, the Tennessee Society of New York. But Tennesseans in New York had a big reception for him at the Waldorf Astoria. But Prentice Cooper predicted that FDR would win Tennessee in 1940. But he gave a talk about Tennessee being the inner citadel of the American defense, which is an interesting way to look at things as it happened. He knew nothing about the Manhattan Project. In fact, he opposed the Manhattan Project later on, but he later came around. But the Tennessee exhibit, Knoxville was said to be the only city that was advertising itself from Tennessee, but was advertising mostly new developments in the region, especially the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which were pretty new at the time, and Norris Dam, which was almost brand new then. But they were showing this off, these regional attractions, as representative of what Tennessee was doing. What's the next one, Paul? Is this the last of the New York one? No, here's Cordell Hull. I threw him in here because he was not from Knoxville, but of course from Tennessee. Was senator and was Secretary of State. but was a much admired figure. He, about the year after the New York World's Fair, Gary Cooper made a movie called Sergeant York. And in the movie, both Sergeant York and Cordell Hull, who were together at the New York World's Fair, are both characters in the movie Sergeant York with Gary Cooper. So this is interesting to me for people who like weird coincidences. Anyway, that's what's next, Paul? Oh yeah, here's I mentioned television. New York World's Fair was all about modern new stuff. And a lot of people talk about the robot, the Westinghouse Robot. And we recently saw a lecture through UT last week of a guy with a color film of the Westinghouse Robot at the New York World's Fair. And Paul, through photo research, found that the Westinghouse Robot, the same guy, had been in Knoxville the year earlier at the Tennessee Valley Fair. Actually, the Tennessee Valley Electrical Exposition. I don't know if this was connected to the fair or not, but Willie Vocalite was his kind of uneuphonious name. But he had been here in Knoxville before he made the big time up at the New York World's Fair. And even before that, his ancestor was another Westinghouse Robot, a little bit cruder in shape, who was at the Tennessee Valley Fair in '35. So you never know what you're going to miss if you miss the Tennessee Valley Fair. It might be stuff that's going to later be a star at a World's Fair. Next one, please. All right, we skipped several years because there actually weren't many really big notable World's Fairs for a while, especially in America. But one was the Century 21 Exposition in Seattle, and it was not a big real estate thing. It was about the future again, like the New York World's Fair of '39 had been. It was looking to our century today and trying to picture what that would be like in Seattle in 1962. And this, of course, is the Space Needle, I guess the tallest and most famous of America's World's Fair structures today. But it was a very, very scientific. It was all about scientific achievement, especially in terms of space exploration. And I first thought we wouldn't include this because I didn't know of any Knoxville connections to it. It's very far away from Knoxville. But surprisingly, one of my favorite writers of this era and time, who's best known for writing about woods and rivers and things, Wilma Dykeman went to the Seattle World's Fair and wrote about for the New Sentinel back in '62. Actually wrote a few articles about it, and she was completely fascinated with it. She thought science was that it proved that science was the way to solve all our problems in the future, and was describing in detail what she saw at the Seattle Fair. And interestingly, remember Estes Kefauver was a young man, little known congressman. This is 23 years later. Estes Kefauver was at this fair too, making speeches. So as a well-known senator, this is the year before he died. But he was there as well. So this is some overlap and connections. Another one that you might not think that we would mention in a story about Knoxville and World's Fairs is the one in Montreal in 1967. This is the big fair and Canada's biggest fair ever. It was an enormous fair. I talked to a few people who've been there, but not many. But it was famous for the famous Geodesic Dome that was designed by Buckminster Fuller. This was kind of seen as the shape of the future. There was a Geodesic Dome 15 years later at the Knoxville Fair too, but it's a much smaller one. But this was an enormous one. It was 250 feet wide. But it formed the U.S. Pavilion. That's what it was. But something I didn't know until I did the research for this talk. We were thought about including it anyway because Buckminster Fuller, the famous architect, kind of futurist, modernist architect, was in Knoxville a few days before this fair opened. And he was being interviewed by the national press about this amazing geodesic dome, which was just being unveiled in Montreal. when he was still in Knoxville. He was here for a couple of days giving a series of lectures at UT. And I thought that's an interesting connection to mention, at least mention the Montreal Fair going by. But guess what? That's made out of steel, a steel structure. But guess what? What contains it? It has a plastic windows. Each one of those is a separate plastic window. Guess who made those? Roman Haas plastic company in Knoxville. They're plexiglass windows, and they made how many were there? Different panels. 200,000 square feet of plastic from Knoxville was what filled in that big geodesic dome by Buckminster Fuller and Montreal. The structure is still there. Unfortunately, the Knoxville part is not. There was a fire in the 70s, and the plexiglass all burned up in the fire. But I don't know if it melts or literally combusts, but it burned up. But it's now the steel superstructure is still there, and you can still go inside it and see it. I've never seen it, but it's an amazing thing. Finally, I'm going to talk about one more fair that had a big influence on Knoxville, and it was just about 7 years later in Spokane, Washington. I'm sorry. Here's didn't mention this one, the Hemisphere in Texas. I've actually been up at in that structure. That's the second tallest structure in among World's Fair structures in America. But here's the Spokane, Washington Fair. And this fair had a big influence on Knoxville because people looked at this, Knoxvillians looked at this and said, wait a second, Spokane's about our size, maybe a little bit smaller in the 70s. If they can have a fair, why can't we? And actually there was just one guy who I think he went there and had a look around. His name was Stuart Evans. He was a World War II veteran. But he came back, and actually the day after the Spokane Fair closed, he came back and gave a talk to the downtown Knoxville organization and said, you know what, I think we could do this here. And they had an environmental theme there. It was a little bit disappointing that the turnout, but still about 5 million people went there. They didn't have any big theme structures, as you see. They actually had one old, preserved old clock tower from a train station that had been torn down, but the clock tower was still there. It was the tallest structure on the fair site. But the Spokane Fair, the fact that Spokane was small, and the fact that Knoxville in 1974, remember what was going on in 1974? It was the energy crisis, and this was people were looking around for different kinds of solutions to the energy crisis, and it was Stuart Evans who proposed, literally in November of '74, the day after this fair closed. I think that we can posit Knoxville as an energy center for America because of the adjacency of the Tennessee Valley Authority headquarters and Oak Ridge National Laboratory and University of Tennessee and their energy research. All these things together would make a great excuse for a World's Fair, and it was very convincing. They convinced the Bureau of International Expositions in Paris to sanction the Knoxville World's Fair, and that's what we came up with. We have one more picture, I think, showing what they originally saw this World's Fair as looking at, and actually it looked a lot like that. The final product, which I remember very well, as a lot of you all do too. I worked there almost every day of it. Anyway, that was just something that I hope that made sense as a kind of a global look at World's Fairs and their connections to Knoxville before the World's Fair. I was thinking about trying to include all this in our booklet, but I realized there's just too much story there for a booklet, which I think is mainly about the 1982 World's Fair. But I thought that this is something that is relevant to the subject of the 40th anniversary of the World's Fair, and we're still actually just scratching the surface about what Knoxvillians were at what World's Fairs and what they found there and what they brought back. But would love to hear any comments or questions or anything of that nature now. Thanks a lot to Paul James, by the way, for doing all this photo research. This was fun just to see these pictures of these World's Fairs over the years, and imagine what was going on there and what familiar faces you would see at every one of these fairs. But anyway, well, thanks. We're past our hour. I'll let you all. I'll dismiss you all if you all want to have some supper or something. But I've enjoyed going through this with you all. This is more fun than a lot of our presentations to me, because I actually learned a lot as we were doing this. I learned some of this afternoon, literally. But it's an interesting subject. The impact of World's Fairs even on a mid-sized city and that mid-sized city's impact on World's Fairs.